Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're, diving in, deep that is, into the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. And you've given us a podcast episode to work with, and it really frames this event, this uprising, as much more than just, names and dates on a timeline. It gets into the human side, like the agony of hoping for something, expecting something that just doesn't come, the weight of promises, and honestly, kind of the messy birth of a whole new global conflict. Expert speaker, what makes the Warsaw Uprising so tragically pivotal?
It really is something, isn't it? Almost Shakespearean when you think about it. Heroism, betrayal, and this massive what-if hanging over everything. The Warsaw Uprising, I think, really pulls back the curtain on how differently even allies, even people supposedly on the same side, can view the future, especially with victory seemingly so close, but also shrouded in all this suspicion.
Okay, so our listeners can really grasp this, paint a picture for us. It's August 1944. Warsaw is, for lack of a better term, stuck. Occupied by the Nazis, but with the Soviets closing in, pushing closer every single day. What was the feeling, the mood like in the city?
Oh, man. Just imagine the tension, right?
Yeah.
Years, literal years, under the Nazis, under their boot, and suddenly there's this glimmer of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel, but with it, so much uncertainty, right? The Polish resistance, they're called the Home Army, they see this as their chance, not just to get rid of the Germans, but to really, truly decide what Poland would be.
And that's key here, because it wasn't just about kicking out the bad guys, was it? It was about, who they wanted to be after the war, right? After the dust settled.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. The Home Army, they were loyal to the Polish government in exile, the one in London, not the Soviets. And they were afraid, and I mean rightfully so, that being liberated by the Soviets might just mean trading one dictator for another. They wanted a Poland that was actually independent, truly free.
And so they decide to take a chance, take their destiny into their own hands. August 1st, 1944, the uprising begins. And they're depending on the Soviets, right? They have to be banking on the Soviets, backing them up, taking advantage of this momentum. But then, nothing. The Red Army stops. Just halts. It's like if, you're about to help a friend move, you pull up with your truck, you see all those boxes, and then just decide to grab coffee instead.
Yeah. It's that same feeling of just total disbelief. And this standstill, this unexpected pause, it's fueled, literally fueled, decades of debate among historians. The Orthodox School of thought, and these are folks like George Kennan, they tell you this was all a cold, calculated move by Stalin.
He saw an opening, is that what you're saying? Like
Yeah.
a chance to wipe out a potential problem before it even really began? Eliminate the competition, so to speak.
Yeah. Exactly that. Kennan and those who think like him, they believe that Stalin saw the Home Army, saw these passionate Polish nationalists as a direct threat to his whole vision. His vision of a Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe after the war, letting the Nazis soften them up, weaken them. Brutally convenient, if we're being honest.
It's chilling, really chilling. A prime example of the ends justify the means kind of thinking, even if it meant, sacrificing an ally in the process. And this wasn't just some, fringe theory, right? This podcast episode mentions Arthur Koestler, and he's a guy who knew a thing or two about Stalinism and what it was really about. He backed this view.
Oh, 100%. Koestler, this is a guy who had been a communist. He'd seen that world from the inside. He argued that this was Stalin's playbook to a T. You completely eliminate anyone, anything that could even remotely be considered a challenge. It's a dark, dark way to see the world, but, Stalin's track record.
You have to wonder if we're talking about being ruthless, being pragmatic, or just straight up paranoia. But like you said, there's always another side to every story. And that's where these revisionist historians kind of step in, don't they? Offering a different perspective, a counter narrative to that whole puppet master Stalin thing we were just talking about.
Yeah, you could say that. They shift our focus. They pull us away from these big conspiracies, these shadowy figures, and put our feet back on the ground.
Yeah.
Remind us we're talking about soldiers, about real people, not just, pieces on a chessboard.
And that's where, I'm picturing someone like David Glantz poring over maps, digging through troop movements, really getting into the weeds of it all.
Exactly. You got it. Glantz, he's a military historian, right? And
Yeah.
he tells you the Red Army they just weren't ready not to storm Warsaw like that. They were spent, just completely drained after fighting and fighting and fighting. Their supplies were low, their lines were thin. It was a mess.
So maybe it wasn't so much about some evil plan, more about just being done.
Yeah.
At the end of their rope.
That's Glantz's argument. He's not letting Stalin off entirely. No way. He acknowledges the distrust. But he wants us to understand the reality, the real, tangible problems of even attempting something like that at that moment, launching a major offensive right then, right there, especially into a city as fortified as Warsaw. It would have been a nightmare.
So maybe not malicious, but a perfect storm, right?
Yeah.
Exhaustion, bad timing. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it? If Stalin hadn't seen the Polish resistance as such a threat, would it have been different? Would he have seen them as, I don't know, comrades instead of competition? But it seems like this episode you've brought us, it doesn't stop there. It keeps digging. It keeps asking why.
And thank goodness for that, because there's still more to uncover, right? There are layers here. We've got to factor in the psychology, the political realities, the whole context. That's where the post-revisionists come in. They offer, I think, even more nuanced interpretations.
Okay, hit me with those nuances then. What are we talking about here?
All right, try this on for size. John Lewis Gaddis, his big name, a really important voice in this camp. And Gaddis, he wants us to, I don't know, to really put ourselves in Stalin's shoes for a second. Really try to inhabit that headspace. Imagine the trauma, right? The sheer scale of loss on the Eastern Front, the devastation. Millions dead. Millions.
So from that viewpoint, from that perspective, maybe consolidating his control over Eastern Europe, maybe that wasn't just about ideology, huh? Maybe it was about survival, about creating a buffer zone, a wall between him and the West.
Exactly. Exactly. That's Gaddis's point, you see. The West, they hadn't really experienced that level of destruction on their own soil. Not really. So they missed something. They missed the depth of that paranoia, the insecurity that was driving Stalin. And look, Gaddis, he's not saying Stalin was a good guy. Not at all. But he's saying there was a tragic miscalculation, a misunderstanding on both sides.
And speaking of miscalculations, Stalin wasn't the only one with a lot on the line, was he? This podcast episode did a good job of highlighting how different Roosevelt's approach was, especially compared to Churchill. They were coming at this whole thing from totally different angles.
Oh, night and day. And that's where Melvin P. Loeffler's work comes in. The realist perspective, as it's called. Loeffler really emphasizes Roosevelt's, I don't know how to put it, his pragmatism. See, Roosevelt wasn't laser-focused on liberating Eastern Europe. His priority, aching the alliance together, keeping everyone on the same page long enough to defeat Hitler, even if it meant making compromises, short-term concessions.
Because a broken alliance, a fractured alliance, that just meant the war would drag on. And don't forget, Roosevelt's got the Pacific Theater to worry about too, right? He needed the Soviets. He needed them on his side, fighting the same fight.
100%. The fate of Warsaw, it's awful to say, but in a way it became a bargaining chip, a pawn in a much larger game.
And it's heartbreaking when you really think about it, isn't it? You've got these global powers, these massive forces playing their strategic chess game. And meanwhile, the people of Warsaw they're living through hell on earth, betrayed by the very people who were supposed to be coming to their rescue, left to face the Nazis with almost no hope. Can you even fathom that? That feeling of abandonment, the disillusionment.
It's almost impossible for us to really grasp, isn't it? Sitting here, safe and sound, all these years later, to fight with that much courage, that much heart, fueled by the belief that liberation is right around the corner, only to have that hope ripped away. And on top of the physical devastation, right, the loss of life, the destruction, on top of all that, they're dealing with this crushing disappointment. And the episode really highlights how furious Churchill was, how he saw this as a betrayal of everything they were fighting for.
Right. The episode even quotes him, doesn't it? Comparing what the Soviets did to some of the darkest moments in history. This wasn't just a military maneuver to him. This was different. You can practically hear the Iron Curtain speech echoing in his words, can't you? A line had been crossed and there was no going back. This was the beginning of the end.
Like watching, I don't know, like when those dominoes fall, setting off this chain reaction that snowballs into the Cold War. And caught in the middle of it all, right at the heart of it, is this city, Warsaw, forced to bear the weight of these shattered alliances.
It really does feel like watching a train wreck in slow motion, doesn't it? You can see the pieces coming apart, the disaster about to happen, but no one can or will stop it. So with all of this swirling around, all of these forces colliding, the bravery of the uprising, the political maneuvering, the just absolutely devastating consequences, what's the takeaway for our listener? What are you hoping people walk away with after this deep dive?
If I had to pick one thing, it would be this. History isn't neat, is it? It isn't some tidy story with clear heroes and villains, dates and battles. It's messy. It's a tapestry, but one woven from all these choices, big and small, that people made. The Warsaw Uprising, it forces us to look beyond the headlines,
Yeah.
to think about the real human cost of these grand strategies, these political games, and to really grapple with the fact that sometimes, even when there are victors, even when the good guys win, there are still people left behind, people who pay the price.
And so often, it's those left behind who end up paying the highest price. We can talk about Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, but what about the everyday people in Warsaw, the people who sacrificed everything? Those are the stories that stick with me.
Absolutely, 100%. Their stories, those individual acts of courage, of resilience, in the face of just unimaginable odds. Those are the threads that make history real, that give it weight and meaning.
Well said. Well said. Listeners, you've been given a lot to consider today, a lot to unpack. If this conversation has sparked even a little bit of curiosity, I encourage you to dig deeper, delve into the Warsaw Uprising, uncover those individual stories. It's a journey worth taking. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.